Hello everyone. The Iran war has been going on for 2 months now. According to US law, after the president initiates military action, it must end within 60 days. Otherwise, congressional approval is required to continue the operation. So, what about today? The 60-day deadline expires today, May 1st. And today, the Trump administration notified Congress that the state of hostilities with Iran has ended, so we don't need congressional authorization. But has the state of hostilities really ended? Does Trump really not need congressional authorization? In addition, the latest news is that Iran, through Pakistan, has submitted a new proposal, but today Trump said that this proposal is not good enough. So today, let's talk about whose authority it is to wage war within the American system and what kinds of checks and balances exist. Also, what exactly is congressional authorization? Of course, before we get into the discussion, let me remind everyone, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please do so and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our episodes. All right, let's talk about how the US Constitution grants Congress the power to declare war. Under Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the power to declare war. The President is Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, directing military operations and responding to urgent threats, but cannot unilaterally declare war. Congress declares war, provides funding, and regulates it. This balances power, ensuring war-making authority rests with the people's representatives. The president instead executes the war, commands troops, and defends against immediate attacks. But for sustained overseas conflict, Congress must authorize it. Post-World War II, US presidents, as commander-in-chief, repeatedly deployed troops without congressional declarations, like in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. The Vietnam War lasted 10 years, killing over 58,000 Americans and wounding hundreds of thousands. This sparked massive anti-war sentiment, leading Congress to reclaim its war oversight. So, in November 1973, the US Congress passed the War Powers Resolution by an overwhelming majority. According to this resolution, the president must notify Congress within 48 hours after taking military action, and within 60 days must decide whether to halt the military operation or seek congressional authorization to continue fighting. However, this act has always been subject to constitutional controversy, mainly because Article 2 of the Constitution stipulates that the president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, granting the president the inherent right to rapidly deploy troops in emergencies to protect national interests. Presidents believe that when facing sudden threats, such as terrorist attacks or threats to allied personnel, they can take action without prior approval from Congress. The resolution mandates troops be withdrawn within 60 days, or 90 with an extension. Presidents argue this is Congress legislatively limiting their constitutional powers, which violates separation of powers and checks and balances. Therefore, successive presidents have generally considered these provisions unconstitutional. However, for political reasons, most have complied with the procedural requirement of reporting to Congress, but they have also made it clear that they do not recognize the resolution as binding on the president. President Trump officially notified Congress of military action against Iran on March 2nd. Counting 60 days from that date, the deadline is today, May 1st. Currently, the position of President Trump and his administration is that military operations were suspended when the ceasefire agreement took effect on April 8th. Therefore, the 60-day deadline has not been reached. At the Senate hearing on Thursday, Secretary of War Haig also stated, "We are currently in a ceasefire." Our understanding is that the 60-day clock is paused or stopped during the ceasefire. Today, the Trump administration formally sent a letter to Congress stating that the state of hostilities with Iran has ended, that no further authorization from Congress is needed, and even claiming that congressional authorization is unconstitutional. Of course, the claim that the state of hostilities has ended may not be accepted by Democrats. After all, the Trump administration is currently enforcing a maritime blockade of Iranian ports, and such a military blockade is also considered a military action. Furthermore, if in the short term the Trump administration decides that a final strike against Iran is necessary, would congressional authorization ultimately still be required? All right, let's talk about what congressional authorization is and how past presidents have used it. Congressional authorization refers to a resolution passed by Congress called the AUMF, which stands for Authorization for Use of Military Force, a resolution that authorizes the use of military force. This authorization allows the president to conduct sustained military operations against Iran. Such authorizations were invoked during the Gulf War in 1991, the Iraq War in 2003, and the war in Afghanistan that began in 2001. Let's quickly review what happened after Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1991. President George H.W. Bush ordered the launch of Operation Desert Shield, and the U.S. military began large-scale deployments to Saudi Arabia to prevent further Iraqi aggression. On January 12, 1991, the U.S. Congress passed the AUMF, authorizing the use of military force against Iraq. Afterward, President George H.W. Bush signed it into effect. This resolution, the AUMF resolution, explicitly referenced the War Powers Resolution, thereby constituting a specific statutory authorization. This allowed the president's actions to comply with the requirements and avoided the 60-day troop withdrawal limitation. On January 17th, the US-led coalition launched Operation Desert Storm, starting the air campaign. The Air Force and Navy bombed Iraq's key military infrastructure for about 5 weeks. On February 28th, President Bush declared a ceasefire. That was the Gulf War. Then in 2003, the George W. Bush administration launched the Iraq War. Before starting the war, they sought authorization from Congress. In October 2002, Congress passed the AUMF authorizing military action against Iraq. On March 19, 2003, the war officially broke out. In early April, coalition forces captured Baghdad and Saddam's regime collapsed. On May 1st, George W. Bush announced the end of major combat operations aboard an aircraft carrier. The cause of the war in Afghanistan was the 9/11 terrorist attacks suffered by the United States. 3 days after 9/11, on September 14th, the U.S. Congress passed the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force resolution in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate vote was 98-0, and the House was 420-1, almost unanimous approval. So what did this resolution entail? At the time, the resolution authorized the president to use all necessary and appropriate force to deal with organizations or individuals who planned, carried out, or harbored those responsible for the 9/11 attacks. On October 7, 2001, the war in Afghanistan officially began. The US-UK coalition first launched airstrikes against Taliban and al-Qaeda targets. Afterwards, special forces cooperated with the anti-Taliban local force, the Northern Alliance, to conduct ground operations. In the early stages of the war, they achieved a swift victory and quickly overthrew the Taliban regime. However, afterwards it turned into a prolonged insurgency and national reconstruction. Compared to the swift and decisive victory of the First Gulf War, both the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War can be said to have become quagmires. This is also why Americans today are very sensitive about sending ground troops, about entering another country. In the Gulf War, after the ceasefire, the coalition forces quickly reduced their troop numbers. Most American troops withdrew within weeks or at most a few months. The U.S. military did not carry out a large-scale occupation or regime change operation. Saddam's regime continued to govern. The war ended with limited objectives, avoiding a prolonged conflict deep inside Iraq. U.S. military casualties were also very low, with about 148 killed in action. What about the Iraq War? In the early stages, after quickly occupying Baghdad and overthrowing Saddam's regime, the focus shifted to large-scale national reconstruction, establishing a democratic government, training new Iraqi military and police forces, rebuilding infrastructure, women's rights, and so on. However, at that time, the United States was not prepared, so actions like the large-scale removal of former regime members, including many mid- and lower-level officials and soldiers, led to administrative collapse. This also caused many former soldiers to turn into members of terrorist organizations, leading to the rise of ISIS. In addition, the new Iraqi government was corrupt and incompetent, and the training of the military and police was ineffective. Then, the main forces of the former regime continued to launch guerrilla warfare, roadside bombings, suicide attacks, and so on, resulting in ongoing casualties for the U.S. military. So, in the end, after Obama took office, the U.S. began to gradually withdraw its troops, completing the withdrawal in 2011. By then, 8 years had passed since the war began. The total cost of the Iraq War was over $1 trillion US dollars. About 4,500 US soldiers were killed, more than 30,000 were wounded, and it is estimated that over 100,000 Iraqi civilians died. As for the war in Afghanistan, it lasted for 20 years. After the Taliban regime was overthrown, the United Nations supported the establishment of an interim government. In the early stages, the number of US troops stationed there was still relatively limited, just several thousand, or at most tens of thousands. However, as the mission shifted from counterterrorism to nation-building, troop numbers continued to increase. In 2006, troop numbers were increased due to the resurgence of the Taliban. At its peak, there were as many as 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. The reason the US got bogged down was because it shifted from limited counterterrorism operations to endless nation-building. Anti-corruption efforts, women's rights, and so on all lacked clear standards for victory and an exit strategy. The Afghan government was corrupt and the military training failed, causing the US to invest huge sums of money but unable to establish a sustainable regime. In the end, the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan in August 2021. America's 20-year nation-building effort ended in complete failure. The cost of this war exceeded $2 trillion. About 2,500 US soldiers were killed, and more than 20,000 were wounded. Now, as for the current Iran war, it has only lasted 2 months so far. Trump is clearly determined not to repeat the same quagmire. Therefore, he has been extremely cautious about deploying ground troops. Although there have been repeated reports that the military already had plans to seize Khark Island, in the end, Trump did not adopt them and instead opted for a blockade. Recently, Trump told the media, "The blockade is a stroke of genius, okay? The blockade is 100% foolproof." This statement is so characteristic of Trump. Then on Wednesday, when Hegseth was testifying before the House Armed Services Committee, he responded to a Democratic congressman. He sternly rebuked the characterization of the Iran war as a quagmire. He said, "Our generation served in the quagmires of Iraq and Afghanistan, enduring years of vague missions and utopian nation-building, and in the end, we gained nothing. And now, after only 2 months, you dare to slander our troops like this and call this a quagmire? That is truly shameful." Hegseth was born in 1980 and participated in both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, so I believe what he said comes from the heart. Let me briefly talk about his military career. After graduating from Princeton University in 2003, Hegseth joined the Minnesota Army National Guard as an infantry officer. In the mid-2000s, he served as an infantry platoon leader in the 101st Airborne Division, taking part in counterinsurgency operations during the Iraq War. The 101st Airborne Division is one of the most famous and legendary division-level units in the US Army. It played an important role in the 1991 Gulf War, the Iraq War, and the Afghanistan War, and is often used as a rapid response force. The 101st Airborne is featured in works like Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers. It is highly regarded by the American public. Serving as a platoon leader in this elite division, Hegseth's physical fitness was likely exceptional. No wonder wherever he goes, he always does physical training together with military officers or soldiers. He even trained with Japan's Minister of Defense, Koizumi, and ended up exhausting him to the point of dehydration. All right, of course, Koizumi mainly transitioned from a civilian position to the Minister of Defense, so you can't really compare them directly. But as a platoon leader in the 101st Airborne Division, that's a position that requires brains, not just physical strength, but also intelligence. You have to be smart enough. Then, in the later stages of the Afghanistan War, Hegseth served as a counterinsurgency instructor, teaching at the Counterinsurgency Training Center in Kabul. After 2021, he basically retired, and his rank before retirement was major. Most people's impression of Hegseth is that he's a Fox News host, but in fact he's a veteran with nearly 20 years of military service, while his media career has only been 4 or 5 years. All right, so back to the topic of congressional authorization. Alaska Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski recently said that when the Senate reconvenes on May 11th, she will introduce a bill authorizing the use of military force against Iran. Of course, she also mentioned that the bill will include some restrictive clauses and reporting requirements. It's not a blank check where you can do whatever you want. If such a bill is introduced, it currently appears that the chances of it passing in both the House and Senate, where the Republicans hold a slim majority, are still relatively high. So, does Trump ultimately need to seek congressional authorization? Well, that still depends on how the situation develops over the next 30 days. For now, the blockade remains very effective. According to U.S. Central Command on Thursday, 44 commercial vessels serving Iran have already been ordered to turn back or return to port. According to a commodity data company, their data shows that there is no evidence indicating that any Iranian oil tankers have broken through the U.S. blockade and reached Chinese customers or other buyers. For many years, Iran has relied on this shadow fleet to evade sanctions. In the previous episode, we also introduced the situation of the shadow fleet. This fleet uses various methods like turning off transponder systems, falsifying records, conducting ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the ocean, transferring oil from one vessel to another, using all sorts of tactics. In the end, they would transport the oil to China. But now, Tehran's oil tankers are unable to break through the blockade set by U.S. warships. These warships pursue the tankers all the way to the Indian Ocean and detain them. So now, this shadow fleet has basically become ineffective as well. Iran's economy is now on the verge of collapse, with over 1 million people unemployed, food prices soaring, and the value of the Iranian currency has already shrunk by more than half. $1 can now be exchanged for 1.8 million rials. At present, it looks like both sides are playing a game of chicken to see who blinks first. Iran is betting that the US won't be able to hold out and will end the blockade of Iranian ports, which would reassure the global market and lower gasoline prices. US officials, on the other hand, are betting that as the economic crisis deepens, Iran will eventually compromise. But at the same time, both sides are considering resorting to renewed military action to escalate the conflict and break the deadlock. On Thursday, Mojtaba Khamenei, the so-called supreme leader of Iran, whom no one has ever seen before, said in a written statement that Iran would protect its nuclear and missile capabilities, calling them national assets, and that the only place for the United States in the Persian Gulf is at the bottom of the sea. Of course, at present, the United States does not have a single ship at the bottom of the sea, while all 159 vessels of the Iranian Navy are indeed at the bottom of the sea. So for Iran to want the United States to end up at the bottom of the sea, that's quite a difficult task. But at the very least, this statement seems to send a message that Iran is still taking a tough stance. Iran has threatened to use weapons that have never been used before to attack American warships, including submarines and dolphins carrying naval mines. Well, I have no idea what that is. Could it be that they're actually... are they talking about strapping naval mines to dolphins for suicide attacks? That's really interesting and honestly quite funny. As for the Revolutionary Guard, they recently released a map of the undersea internet cables passing through the Strait of Hormuz, subtly warning that these telecommunications infrastructures could become targets for attack. Also, targeting energy or infrastructure in neighboring Gulf countries is an Iranian option. US and Israeli forces are planning a strike. Reports say Central Command leaders met Trump yesterday, offering strike options in a 45-minute meeting. And today, when speaking with reporters, Trump also admitted that the military did indeed show him options for completely destroying Iran, but he still hopes it won't come to that. But Iran is deeply divided internally. Trump said that the Iranian leadership is very divided. He said the Iranian leadership consists of 2 or 3 factions, maybe even 4. In any case, it's a very fractured leadership. Nevertheless, they all want to reach an agreement, but they're all in a mess. On Thursday night, Iran submitted the text of its latest negotiation proposal to Pakistan. But today, Trump responded that he is not satisfied with Iran's proposal. He said they made demands that he could not agree to. Reportedly, Iran's version set aside the condition that the U.S. must lift sanctions as a precondition for negotiations, but still did not make any concessions on agreeing to discuss the removal of nuclear weapons. Trump also hinted that, given the severe divisions within Iran's leadership, Iranian officials may never be able to resolve the war through negotiations. So, will it be war or talks? Will Iran eventually make concessions? Everything is still in flux. But on the other hand, this Iran war has unexpectedly made the United States the biggest beneficiary in terms of energy. The United States is already the world's largest crude oil producer. By 2025, its daily production will reach 13.6 million barrels, surpassing Russia's 9.1 million barrels per day and Saudi Arabia's 9.3 million barrels per day. Before the war, U.S. crude oil exports were about 4 million barrels per day, mostly light shale oil. After the outbreak of the war, exports surged to around 5.2 million barrels per day, an increase of 1.2 million barrels. Due to the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, buyers in Asia and other parts of Europe were urgently seeking alternatives, and U.S. shale oil, with its high-quality, rapid production increase and flexible supply, became the top choice. The rise in oil prices has also allowed shale oil producers to make significant profits. The break-even point for U.S. shale oil is roughly between $40 and $70 per barrel. That is, the cost is $40 to $70 per barrel. With high oil prices, both existing wells and new drilling operations are making substantial profits, which can greatly stimulate production capacity. In addition, high oil prices often drive up natural gas production as well. By 2025, the marketized natural gas output in the United States will account for about a quarter of the global total. In 2025, U.S. natural gas exports have already set a record. To avoid risks in the Middle East, Europe and Asia will increase their purchases of U.S. natural gas. In the near future, this natural gas growth will provide significant export revenues and jobs. It can be said that this conflict has brought a demand dividend to the U.S. energy industry under the supply shock. In the short term, rising oil prices may mean that American consumers have to pay more for fuel, but for producers, exporters, and the overall energy hegemony, it represents a clear and long-term strategic advantage. The United States, you could say, is the biggest beneficiary of the Middle East turmoil, further consolidating its position as the world's largest energy superpower. In other positive news for the U.S., the Wall Street Journal reports China's heavy rare earth monopoly has ended. Australia's Lynas has started production, beginning last month with dysprosium oxide, a scarce heavy rare earth vital for defense. It helps make heat-resistant magnets used in military fighter jets and missiles. If you know the rare earth industry or watched my programs on China's rare earth advantage, you likely know the CCP monopolizes these products. Nearly 99% of heavy rare earths are refined there. Dysprosium is a critical heavy rare earth for military use. U.S. F-35 jets and other military gear rely entirely on Chinese dysprosium. However, after the CCP used rare earths as a weapon and restricted exports in April last year, it triggered a high level of alert in the United States and Western countries, who immediately began restructuring their supply chains. Many experts predict that in the field of light, rare earths, it may be possible to break free from dependence on the CCP within 2 years. In the case of heavy rare earths, it may take more than 5 years. However, the latest reports show that once the United States and its allies fully commit to this field, the speed at which they catch up is astonishing. Last year, the U.S. military invested billions of dollars to acquire shares in MP Materials, the largest rare earth producer in the United States. At the same time, they also invested in several foreign rare earth companies, including Australia's Lynas Corporation. In March of this year, Lynas announced a preliminary agreement worth $96 million. This agreement is for the Pentagon to purchase rare earth products from Lynas. According to a report by the Wall Street Journal, for more than a decade, Lynas has operated a refinery at the Malaysian chemical hub. But this plant only produces the more common light rare earths, while the heavy rare earths are sold to China for processing. Last year, during the height of the U.S.-China trade war, Lynas completed the construction of a new heavy rare earth processing facility in Kuantan. And last month, Lynas achieved commercial production at the site. According to a Lynas company executive, no one outside of China has produced separated heavy rare earths in the past 30 years. The separated heavy rare earths are in powder form, and after being delivered to customers, they are added in small amounts to magnets. This allows the magnets to operate at higher temperatures, which is crucial for cars and airplanes whose engines generate a lot of heat. Lynas also plans to build a second, larger heavy rare earth processing facility in Kuantan, which is expected to be completed in 2028. The U.S. Department of Defense has stipulated that 2027 is the final deadline. After 2027, it must be ensured that the rare earths in the magnet supply chain do not come from China. Currently, Lynas is supplying its rare earths to Japanese magnet manufacturers, and these companies in turn supply the US defense industry. Lynas and MP Materials are the two leading rare earth producers in the West, and other rare earth manufacturers are also catching up. For example, there is a company called USA Rare Earth, which is headquartered in Oklahoma. Recently, it has put into operation equipment for manufacturing rare earth magnets. This company has also recently acquired a heavy rare earth mining company in Brazil, which will ultimately allow it to provide a stable supply of heavy rare earths to the United States. So, the rare earth industry is not really some highly sophisticated technological field. After tech breakthroughs and mass production, that's the next step. As I've said, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard uses the Strait of Hormuz as a bargaining chip, much like the CCP playing the rare earth card, a card they can't actually play. So once you play this card, it no longer remains a card. Although in the short term it may cause the world economy some pain, the strait is inanimate, but people are resourceful, and the market will definitely find ways to seek alternatives. There is nothing that cannot be replaced. All right, that's all for our discussion today. If you have any thoughts on the situation in Iran, or whether China can continue to maintain its rare earth advantage, or on Trump's congressional authorization, please feel free to leave a comment below the program. Thank you for watching. We hope you will like, subscribe, and share our content. See you next time.